There are moments in history that exist outside of time, moments that carry so much weight, so much meaning, that they seem to bend reality around themselves, moments that the people who lived through them can never escape, no matter how many years pass, no matter how hard they try to forget. This is the story of one of those moments. Seattle, Washington, March 1994. 2 weeks before the world would lose Kurt Cobain forever. 2 weeks before a gunshot would echo through music history and change everything. 2 weeks before Layne Staley would begin a slow descent into the darkness that would eventually consume him, too. But on this night, neither man knew what was coming. On this night, they were just two musicians sitting in a dimly lit room, sharing a bottle of something strong, talking about the weight that pressed down on their chests every single day. On this night, Kurt Cobain asked Layne Staley a question that would haunt Layne for the rest of his life. "Do you feel it too?" Four words, but Layne couldn't answer. He opened his mouth, tried to speak, but nothing came out, because he knew exactly what Kurt was asking, and the truth was too heavy to say out loud. Seattle in the early 1990s was the center of the musical universe. Something was happening in this rain-soaked city, something that couldn't be explained or manufactured or replicated. A sound was emerging from the basements and garages and small clubs, a sound that was angry and beautiful and broken all at once. A sound that would come to be called grunge, though the musicians who created it hated that word, hated being labeled, hated being put in a box. But the world needed a name for what was happening, and grunge was what stuck. At the center of this movement were four bands: Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, and Alice in Chains. Four bands that would define a generation. Four bands that would sell millions of records and play to sold-out arenas and appear on magazine covers around the world. Four bands whose music would become the soundtrack for millions of young people who felt as lost and confused and angry as the musicians who created it. And at the center of two of these bands were two men who understood each other in ways that few others could. Kurt Cobain, lead singer and guitarist of Nirvana, the reluctant voice of a generation. The man who wrote "Smells Like Teen Spirit" and watched in horror as it turned him into the very thing he hated, a rock star. Layne Staley, lead singer of Alice in Chains, the voice that could make you feel like you were drowning and flying at the same time. The man who sang about addiction with such brutal honesty that listeners felt they were hearing their own secrets screamed back at them. They were different in many ways. Kurt was slight, almost fragile, with blue eyes that seemed to see through everything. Layne was more physically imposing, with a presence that filled rooms, but with eyes that held the same darkness, the same pain, the same desperate search for something that might make the weight bearable. But in the ways that mattered most, they were the same. They both knew what it felt like to be consumed by something you couldn't control. They both knew the particular loneliness of standing on stage in front of thousands of screaming fans and feeling more alone than you've ever felt in your life. They both knew the cruel irony of having your pain turned into entertainment, of having your most private struggles dissected by strangers who thought they understood because they'd memorized your lyrics. They both knew the weight of being chosen, because that's what it felt like, not like they had chosen this life, but like this life had chosen them, like the music was something that lived inside them and demanded to be let out regardless of the cost, like they were vessels for something larger than themselves, something that used them up and didn't care what was left behind. By March of 1994, both men were in trouble. Kurt had just returned from Rome, where he had overdosed on a combination of alcohol and Rohypnol. The official story was that it was an accident, a miscommunication about medication. But people close to him knew the truth, or suspected it, or were afraid to admit what they suspected. He had tried to leave, had tried to escape the weight that was crushing him, and he had been pulled back, revived, returned to a life he wasn't sure he wanted anymore. Layne was in his own battle. Alice in Chains had just released Jar of Flies, an EP that had debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, the first EP ever to do so. The band was at the height of their commercial success, and Layne was deeper into his addiction than he had ever been. The thing about heroin is that it lies to you. It tells you that it's helping, that it's the only thing keeping the darkness at bay, that without it you would drown in the pain that lives inside you. And by the time you realize it's lying, by the time you understand that it's actually making everything worse, it has its hooks so deep in you that escape seems impossible. Layne knew the truth. He knew the drug was killing him. But knowing and being able to do something about it are two very different things. On this particular night in March, both men found themselves at a small gathering at a house in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Seattle. It wasn't a party, not really, just a handful of people from the Seattle music scene, the kind of informal get-together that happened regularly in those days when everyone knew everyone and the walls between bands and fans and friends were thin and permeable. Layne arrived late, around midnight, driven by one of his bandmates who was worried about leaving him alone. He walked through the door and immediately felt the energy in the room shift. Conversations paused, eyes turned toward him, not because he was a celebrity, though he was, because people were worried about him, because he looked bad, really bad, and everyone could see it. He had lost weight, his eyes were hollow, his skin had the grayish pallor of someone who hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. He moved slowly, carefully, like someone who wasn't sure the floor would hold him. But then he saw Kurt sitting alone, in the corner of the room, and something changed in his face. Recognition, understanding, the particular relief of seeing someone who gets it, who doesn't need explanations, who knows what it feels like to carry this weight. Kurt looked up. Their eyes met, and something passed between them that no one else in the room could see or understand. Layne walked over to where Kurt was sitting, didn't ask if he could join him, just sat down on the floor beside him, back against the wall, legs stretched out in front of him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The party continued around them. Conversations, laughter, the clink of bottles, music playing from somewhere in the house. But in their corner, there was silence. The silence of two people who have run out of small talk, who have nothing left to prove to each other, who are too tired to pretend. Kurt was the first to speak. "You look like shit." Layne laughed. A genuine laugh, the first one he'd had in days. "So do you." Kurt nodded slowly. "I know." More silence. But comfortable now. The silence of understanding. "I heard about Rome," Layne said eventually. Kurt didn't react, didn't deny it, didn't explain, didn't offer the official story about accidental overdose, just shrugged slightly, a gesture that said, "You know what happened. We both know." "How bad?" Layne asked. "Bad enough." "But you're here." "I'm here." Layne looked at Kurt's face. Really looked at it. Saw the exhaustion there. The bone-deep weariness of someone who has been fighting a battle they're not sure they can win. He recognized that look. He saw it every time he looked in a mirror. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," Kurt said. His voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, not meant for anyone else to hear, just for Layne. "The music? Everything. The music. The fame, the..." He made a vague gesture that encompassed everything and nothing. "All of it. I'm so tired, Layne. I'm so fucking tired." Layne didn't offer empty reassurances. Didn't say it would get better, that things would work out, that Kurt just needed to hang on a little longer. He didn't say any of the things that people who don't understand always say. Instead, he said, "I know." Because he did know. He knew exactly what Kurt was talking about. The exhaustion that goes beyond physical tiredness, that settles into your bones and your soul and makes every breath feel like a burden. The weight of expectations, of obligations, of being needed by people you don't have the energy to need back. He knew. They sat together for over an hour, talking sometimes, silent sometimes. The party thinned out around them. People left, couples paired off, someone passed out on the couch, but Kurt and Layne stayed in their corner, two satellites orbiting each other, held together by a gravity that no one else could feel. They talked about music. About the songs they were working on, the sounds in their heads that they couldn't quite capture, the frustration of having something perfect in your imagination and watching it become imperfect the moment you try to make it real. They talked about the industry, about the suits who didn't understand anything except numbers, who looked at art and saw only product, who would squeeze every last drop out of you and discard the husk without a second thought. They talked about the fans, about the strange intimacy of having strangers know your secrets, of having your pain become their entertainment, of being loved for the very things that were destroying you. But mostly they talked about the darkness, not directly. They circled around it, approached it from different angles, used metaphors and half-sentences and knowing looks, the darkness that lived inside both of them. The darkness that the drugs sometimes held at bay and sometimes made worse. The darkness that no amount of success or money or fame could touch. And then, around 3 a.m., when the house was nearly empty and the night was at its deepest, Kurt turned to Layne and asked the question, "Do you feel it too?" Layne's breath caught in his chest. He knew what Kurt was asking. Not about the drugs, not about the fame, not about the music or the industry or the fans, about the thing beneath all of that. The thing that made the drugs necessary in the first place. The thing that whispered to you in the quiet hours, telling you that none of this was worth it, that the pain would never end, that there was only one way to make it stop. The thing that Layne heard every single day, but had never admitted to anyone. Kurt was asking if Layne heard it too. And Layne wanted to answer, wanted to say, yes, I hear it every fucking day, and I don't know how to make it stop. Wanted to tell Kurt that he wasn't alone, that there was someone else who understood, that they could carry this weight together. But the words wouldn't come. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again, nothing, because saying it out loud would make it real, would acknowledge the thing that he'd been running from for years, would mean admitting that the darkness wasn't something happening to him, but something that was part of him, something he couldn't escape no matter how far he ran or how much he used. Kurt waited, patient, his eyes holding Layne's, not judging, just waiting for an answer that might never come. And Layne couldn't give it to him. The moment stretched on, seconds that felt like hours. Kurt waiting, Layne unable to speak. Finally Kurt nodded slowly, as if Layne's silence was answer enough, as if the fact that Layne couldn't say it out loud said everything that needed to be said. Kurt said quietly, "Me too." And something broke in Layne, something that he'd been holding together through sheer force of will, through denial, through the numbing power of substances. It cracked. Just a little, just enough for something real to escape. Tears. He felt them on his cheeks before he realized he was crying. Quiet tears, not sobs, just this overwhelming release of something he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to be there. Kurt didn't say anything, didn't try to comfort him, or fix him, or make it better, just sat there present, bearing witness. Sometimes that's all you can do for someone in pain, just be there, just let them know they're not alone. After a while the tears stopped. Layne wiped his face with the back of his hand, took a shaky breath. "I don't know what to do," he said. His voice was raw, broken, stripped of all the armor he usually wore. "I don't know how to make it stop." "I don't either," Kurt admitted. "I've tried everything. Nothing works, not really. Not for long." "So, what do we do?" Kurt was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was even softer, almost inaudible. "I don't know. I keep thinking, maybe if I could just find the right words, put it in a song, get it out of me and into something else, but it doesn't work. It just multiplies. The more I express it, the more of it there is." Layne understood. He'd felt the same thing. Writing songs about his pain didn't exercise it. It just gave it form, made it more real, more present, more powerful. "Maybe we're not supposed to make it stop," Layne said slowly, working through the thought as he spoke it. "Maybe we're just supposed to survive it, day by day, minute by minute." Kurt looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment there was something like hope in his eyes, or maybe not hope exactly. Recognition, connection, the possibility that survival might be enough. Kurt said, "Maybe." The night began to lighten outside, that grey pre-dawn light that seeps into everything, making the world look washed out and uncertain. The house was empty now except for the two of them and someone asleep upstairs who they'd both forgotten about. They should leave. They both knew it. The night was over. The moment was passing. Soon, the world would wake up and demand things from them again, and they would have to put their armor back on and pretend to be the people everyone expected them to be. Kurt stood up first, moved stiffly like his body ached from sitting so long on the hard floor. Layne followed, using the wall to steady himself. They faced each other. Two men who had just shared something that neither of them would ever be able to explain to anyone else. Two men who understood each other in ways that their closest friends and family members never could. "We should do this again," Kurt said. "Talk. For real. Not at a party, just us." Layne nodded. Yeah, we should. It wasn't a promise, exactly. More like an intention. A recognition that what had passed between them tonight was valuable, rare, something worth preserving. Call me, Kurt said. Next week. We'll figure something out. I will. But they both knew, on some level, that neither would admit that it probably wouldn't happen. Because making plans requires energy. Because following through requires hope. Because the darkness had a way of making everything seem pointless, even the things that might actually help. They walked out of the house together, into the grey morning. The air was cold and damp, typical Seattle weather, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you want to crawl back into bed and never leave. Kurt's car was parked at the curb, some kind of sedan, nothing flashy. Kurt had never cared about that stuff. The trappings of rock star success. He just wanted to make music and be left alone. Take care of yourself, Kurt said. You too. They didn't hug, didn't shake hands, just looked at each other one more time. A look that said everything they couldn't put into words. And then Kurt got in his car and drove away. Layne stood on the sidewalk and watched the taillights disappear around a corner. He didn't know that was the last time he would ever see Kurt Cobain alive. Layne stood on the sidewalk and watched the taillights disappear around a corner. The grey Seattle morning pressed down on him like a weight. The air smelled like rain and exhaust and something final. He didn't know it yet, couldn't know it. But that moment, watching Kurt's car vanish into the mist, was the last time he would ever see Kurt Cobain alive. 2 weeks. That's all the time they had left. 2 weeks before the phone would ring with news that would shatter everything. 2 weeks before Layne would understand, with terrible clarity, the true cost of his silence. 2 weeks before the question Kurt asked, "Do you feel it too?" would become the ghost that haunted him for the rest of his life. But on this cold Seattle morning, Layne knew none of that. He just stood there, alone, watching the empty street where Kurt's car had been. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered, "Call him tomorrow. You'll call him tomorrow." Tomorrow never came.